You've cleaned up your diet. You've cut sugar, maybe even tried fasting. You push yourself to stay active, even on days when your body feels like it's moving through mud. From the outside, it looks like discipline. It looks like you're doing everything right, and yet something doesn't add up. You wake up tired even after what should have been a full night of sleep. There's this heaviness that follows you through the day. Your energy flickers, never fully steady. And that stubborn weight, especially around your midsection, just won't respond, no matter how consistent you are. At times, you feel strangely alert, almost restless. But underneath it, you're exhausted, like your body can't decide whether it's in overdrive or completely drained. That's not a failure of willpower. And it's not because your metabolism is slow in the way you've been told. What's happening is far more subtle and far more powerful. Inside your body, a single hormonal signal may be overriding every healthy habit you're trying to build. It's quietly shifting you into a survival mode where repair is paused, fat loss is resisted, and energy production is deliberately dialed down. Your metabolism isn't broken, it's being controlled. And your mitochondria, the very systems responsible for your energy, aren't failing, they're being blocked. What I'm about to explain will change how you understand stress, metabolism, and why your body may be refusing to heal no matter how hard you try. My name is Dr. Gunter. Over the past couple of decades, I've worked closely with patients struggling with stubborn metabolic issues, fatigue that doesn't lift, weight that won't shift, and hormonal patterns that just don't respond the way we expect them to. What's striking is how many of these individuals walk in believing they have a slow metabolism. They've been told that repeatedly, and on the surface, it makes sense. The symptoms line up. But when you look a little deeper, when you start examining how their body is actually regulating energy, stress, and repair, you begin to see a very different picture. I've sat across from people who were doing everything by the book: clean nutrition, regular exercise, even structured fasting protocols. Yet their bodies were resisting every one of those efforts, not because they were doing something wrong, but because something more fundamental was being missed. And to be fair, this isn't just a patient problem. It's a limitation in how we've traditionally approached medicine. We are trained to identify and manage symptoms, sometimes without fully stepping back to assess the regulatory systems driving those symptoms in the first place. Chronic stress biology, in particular, is often underestimated, even by experienced clinicians. But right now, this matters more than ever. We're living in a time where chronic, low-grade stress has become the baseline. Burnout is common. Sleep is compromised. And despite greater awareness around health, we're seeing more people feeling stuck, metabolically resistant, and increasingly disconnected from how their bodies are actually functioning. Most people have been taught to think of metabolism as a simple equation: calories in, calories out. Maybe exercise a little more, tighten up nutrition, and if that doesn't work, then it must be genetics. But that model, while convenient, is incomplete. Metabolism is not just about how much energy you consume or how much you burn. It's about whether your body allows energy to be used in the first place. It's about biological permission. At any given moment, your body is making decisions. Should it burn fuel or conserve it? Should it invest in repair or hold back? Should it build new, efficient cells or protect what's already there? Those decisions are not random. They're governed by signaling systems, hormones, neural inputs, chemical messengers that continuously interpret your internal and external environment. And among those signals, one stands out for its influence: cortisol. Now, cortisol itself is not the enemy. In the short term, it's essential. It helps you wake up, stay alert, respond to challenges. It mobilizes energy when you need it. But when cortisol remains elevated for too long, when the signal never fully turns off, the body begins to shift its priorities. It starts behaving as though it's under constant threat. And from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes perfect sense. For most of human history, sustained stress meant danger, scarcity, uncertainty. In that state, the body doesn't focus on optimizing metabolism or repairing cells. It focuses on survival. The problem is, modern life creates that same signal without the physical resolution. Psychological stress, poor sleep, constant stimulation, They all keep that system activated. And if your body believes it's under continuous threat, it will not prioritize fat loss. It will not prioritize mitochondrial repair. It will protect, conserve, and hold on. To understand what's really happening in the body, you have to stop thinking in isolated parts and start seeing systems talking to each other in real time. There are three core systems involved in everything we're discussing. The first is the stress response system, often called the HPA axis. That stands for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands. It's a chain of communication that starts in the brain. When your brain detects stress, whether physical or emotional, it sends a signal down this pathway, ultimately telling the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Cortisol is not random, it's precise, it's designed for survival. A helpful way to think about this system is like a fire alarm in a building. In a real emergency, it's life-saving. It mobilizes everything, but imagine if that alarm never shuts off. Eventually, the entire building stops functioning normally, not because the alarm is helpful, but because it never resets. The second system is your metabolic system. This is how your body manages fuel. Glucose in the bloodstream, insulin as the regulator, and the decision-making process of whether energy is burned immediately or stored for later. Think of this like a fuel allocation system. At any moment, your body is deciding, do we spend energy now or do we store it in reserves? That decision is constantly being adjusted based on signals from stress, nutrition, and activity. The third system is often the most overlooked, the mitochondria. These are your cellular energy factories. They produce ATP, the usable form of energy that powers everything from muscle contraction to brain function. But they don't just generate energy. They also participate in repair, detoxification, and cellular signaling. You can think of mitochondria like highly specialized factories that require constant maintenance. If they're well supported, they run efficiently. If they're stressed or neglected, production slows and waste builds up. Now here's the critical connection most people miss. Cortisol from the stress system directly influences glucose availability. Glucose levels then influence insulin. And insulin, in turn, determines how mitochondria behave, whether they focus on energy production or conservation. These are not separate systems working independently. They are one integrated survival network, constantly adjusting your biology based on perceived safety or threat. And once you see that clearly, it becomes obvious why everything feels connected. When we zoom deeper into what cortisol is actually doing over time, the picture becomes more layered. It's not one single effect. It's a cascade of small biological shifts that compound into a major metabolic slowdown. The first layer is the cortisol-glucose-insulin loop. When cortisol stays elevated, it signals the liver to release more glucose into the bloodstream. This is useful in short bursts, but chronically, it keeps blood sugar slightly elevated. In response, insulin is released again and again to manage that glucose. Over time, insulin remains consistently active, and one of insulin's core roles is to prevent fat breakdown. So the body gets locked into a storage-dominant state where fat burning is suppressed. Even fasting can feel less effective because the hormonal environment is still saying, store, don't spend. It's like trying to burn fuel while someone keeps topping up the tank faster than you can use it. The second layer involves mitochondrial biogenesis. There is a master regulator inside cells called PGC1A, responsible for building new mitochondria. Chronic cortisol suppresses this pathway. That means fewer new mitochondria are created, reducing the overall energy-generating capacity of the body. Over time, this contributes to fatigue and a loss of metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch smoothly between fuel sources. The third layer is mitophagy, the cleanup system for damaged mitochondria. Under healthy conditions, old or dysfunctional mitochondria are removed and replaced. But chronic stress disrupts this signaling. Damaged mitochondria begin to accumulate, like factories full of broken machinery that never gets repaired or replaced. The fourth layer affects thyroid conversion. Stress hormones interfere with the conversion of T4 into T3, the active thyroid hormone that drives metabolic rate. Even if thyroid levels look normal on paper, the active hormone available to tissues can be reduced, lowering ATP production and slowing metabolism. Finally, there is circadian rhythm disruption. Cortisol is supposed to follow a clear daily rhythm, high in the morning, low at night. Chronic stress flattens this curve. The result is poor sleep quality, reduced nighttime repair, and further metabolic dysregulation. And when you step back, the conclusion becomes clear. The body is not malfunctioning. It is being held in a prolonged defensive state that reshapes every system at once. I remember a patient in her mid-30s who came in extremely frustrated. On paper, she was doing everything that should have worked. She was practicing intermittent fasting, training several times a week, and keeping her diet relatively clean. But instead of progress, she was stuck in a plateau, and what bothered her most was that her energy was getting worse, not better. When we looked deeper into her routine, the pattern became clearer. She had a demanding, high-stress job, was sleeping inconsistently, and often pushing through fatigue with sheer willpower. Her body wasn't responding to her effort because it was already operating under a persistent stress load. Her cortisol pattern reflected that state. We didn't introduce anything extreme. In fact, we scaled back. Her fasting became less aggressive. We focused on stabilizing sleep timing, and we added simple support like magnesium in the evening, along with basic stress regulation practices that helped her downshift at night. Within a few weeks, something shifted. Her energy started to stabilize, and slowly her body began responding again. Fat loss resumed, but more importantly, she stopped feeling like she was constantly running on empty. Another case was a man in his early 40s who struggled with central weight gain and low motivation. His diet wasn't terrible, but he relied heavily on caffeine throughout the day, multiple coffees just to stay functional. What we found was a clear pattern of chronic cortisol stimulation layered over a disrupted circadian rhythm. The approach here was also not complicated. We gradually reduced caffeine intake, encouraged consistent morning sunlight exposure, and introduced regular walking to re-establish natural rhythm signals. In some cases, we also used mild adaptogenic support to help smooth the transition. Over time, his sleep quality improved noticeably. And once his sleep stabilized, his metabolic response began to change. Energy improved, cravings reduced, and his body composition slowly followed. In both cases, the turning point wasn't more intensity. It was reducing the internal stress load so the system could finally reset. When we step back from individual cases and look at the broader scientific literature, the pattern becomes remarkably consistent across multiple fields: endocrinology, metabolic research, and even sleep science. Chronic stress and elevated cortisol have repeatedly been associated with reduced insulin sensitivity. In practical terms, this means the body requires more insulin to manage the same amount of glucose, which gradually shifts metabolism toward fat storage rather than fat utilization. Over time, this is one of the mechanisms linked with stubborn abdominal fat accumulation that doesn't respond well to simple calorie restriction alone. At the cellular level, research in mitochondrial biology shows that prolonged stress exposure is not neutral. Studies published in metabolic and cellular physiology journals suggest that chronic cortisol signaling can reduce mitochondrial efficiency, meaning the mitochondria produce less ATP for the same amount of fuel. This doesn't necessarily mean the mitochondria are failing, but rather that their output is being downregulated under persistent stress signaling. Sleep research adds another important layer. Multiple controlled studies on sleep deprivation and circadian disruption show reduced markers of mitochondrial repair activity during the night. In other words, when sleep is fragmented or shortened, the body loses a critical window where cellular cleanup and energy system restoration normally occur. Endocrinology findings also consistently show that elevated cortisol levels are correlated with central fat distribution, particularly visceral fat around the abdomen. This is not just a cosmetic issue. It reflects a deeper metabolic shift toward energy conservation and stress adaptation. What's important here is the convergence. These findings are not isolated observations from a single field. They point toward a shared biological theme. When the stress system remains chronically activated, multiple downstream processes, glucose regulation, mitochondrial function, and repair cycles are all adjusted in the same direction. In simple terms, the science supports what we see clinically. The body is not randomly breaking down. It is adapting to a prolonged state of perceived stress, even when that stress is no longer appropriate for modern life. When we talk about reversing this pattern, it's important not to think in terms of aggressive interventions. What we're really doing is helping the body exit a prolonged stress state and reestablish normal regulatory rhythms. On the behavioral side, one of the most powerful changes is consistency in sleep and wake timing. The body is highly rhythmic, and when that rhythm is unstable, cortisol signaling becomes disorganized. Alongside that, reducing overly aggressive fasting protocols can be helpful in some individuals, not because fasting is inherently harmful, but because in a chronically stressed physiology, additional energy restriction can sometimes reinforce the survival signal. Instead, steady, low-intensity movement like walking or zone 2 exercise tends to support metabolic function without overloading the stress system. From a nutritional standpoint, the goal is not extreme restriction, but restoration. Nutrients like magnesium in the evening can support nervous system relaxation and help downshift stress signaling. A balanced B complex in the morning can assist energy metabolism and adrenal function. And overall, a whole food dietary pattern provides the substrate the body needs for repair rather than constant adaptation. Certain adaptogens, such as ashwagandha and rhodiola, are sometimes used in this context. It's important to understand they are not sedatives. They don't shut down stress. Instead, they appear to help modulate the stress response, supporting a more balanced cortisol output rather than a constantly elevated one. Environmental inputs matter just as much. Morning sunlight exposure helps anchor circadian rhythm signaling, while reducing blue light exposure at night supports natural melatonin release. Even something as simple as adjusting caffeine timing, avoiding late-day intake, can significantly reduce unnecessary cortisol stimulation. The key idea here is synergy. These are not isolated hacks acting independently. They work because they collectively restore rhythm. And when rhythm returns, the body no longer operates in survival mode. It begins to re-enter a state where energy production, repair, and metabolic flexibility can function normally again. In most cases like this, people expect a rapid transformation, something that feels immediate and dramatic. But what we're actually talking about here is not a hack or a quick metabolic switch. It's a gradual rebalancing of systems that have been pushed into a defensive state for a long time. In the first week, the changes are usually subtle but noticeable if you're paying attention. Sleep often begins to feel slightly deeper, not necessarily longer at first, but less fragmented. People describe it as their mind starting to quiet down at night. That's a sign the nervous system is slowly coming out of a high alert state. By weeks 3 to 4, the shifts become more tangible. Energy tends to stabilize rather than spike and crash throughout the day. That constant sense of being wired but tired starts to fade for many individuals. Cravings, especially for quick energy foods, often reduce as blood sugar regulation becomes more stable. Around the 2 to 3 month mark, more visible metabolic changes can begin to appear. Fat loss becomes more consistent again, particularly around stubborn areas like the abdomen. More importantly, metabolic flexibility starts to return. The body becomes better at switching between fuel sources without feeling stressed or depleted. But the key point here is understanding what this process actually is. This is not a shortcut. It is not forcing the body into change. It is regulation. You are gradually removing the signals that told your body to stay in survival mode and allowing it to return to normal physiological balance. When that happens, the system doesn't just burn fat better, it starts functioning the way it was designed to, responsive, adaptable, and no longer locked in defense. It's important to keep this conversation grounded and medically responsible because while cortisol and stress biology play a major role in metabolic dysfunction, they are not the only factors involved. There are situations where symptoms like fatigue, weight changes, or sleep disruption may be driven by other underlying conditions. Thyroid disorders, anemia, insulin resistance, sleep apnea, and other endocrine or metabolic conditions can present in very similar ways. That's why anyone with persistent or worsening symptoms should consider proper medical evaluation rather than assuming a single cause. It's also worth being cautious with the idea of supplementation. Nutrients like magnesium, B vitamins, or adaptogenic herbs can be supportive in certain contexts, but more is not always better. Over supplementation or using multiple compounds without guidance can sometimes create new imbalances rather than resolving underlying ones. And just as importantly, not every case of fatigue is primarily driven by cortisol dysregulation. Human biology is complex, and while chronic stress is a major contributing factor in many modern cases, it interacts with sleep quality, nutrition, inflammation, and individual physiology in different ways. So, the most accurate way to frame this is not as a single explanation that fits every person, but as a significant piece of a larger puzzle. In many individuals, stress biology and cortisol signaling are a central driver, but they exist alongside other systems that also need attention. The goal is not to oversimplify, but to better understand patterns so that appropriate, balanced decisions can be made with proper context and, when needed, professional support. If we strip everything back to the core message, there are really three ideas that matter most here. First, metabolism is not simply a reflection of calories in and calories out. It is a hormonally regulated system. Your body is constantly interpreting signals, stress, sleep, nutrition, environment, and adjusting whether it should burn energy, store energy, or prioritize repair. Calories matter, but they are only part of the equation. The hormonal context determines how those calories are actually used. Second, chronic elevation of cortisol changes the entire operating state of the body. In the short term, cortisol is adaptive and necessary. But when it stays elevated for long periods, it shifts physiology away from repair and toward conservation. Fat burning becomes less efficient, mitochondrial activity is downregulated, and energy production is suppressed. The body is not malfunctioning. It is following a prolonged survival program. Third, and perhaps most importantly, restoring rhythm is what allows recovery. When stress signals normalize, sleep stabilizes, and the nervous system no longer perceives constant threat, the body gradually reopens access to energy, repair, and metabolic flexibility. This is not an overnight switch, but a coordinated recalibration across multiple systems. The key takeaway is simple, but often misunderstood. You don't necessarily need to push harder. You don't need more restriction, more intensity, or more discipline. In many cases, the real shift happens when you remove what has been blocking your biology from functioning normally in the first place. If you look at the modern world honestly, it's almost built in a way that keeps the stress system quietly activated for long periods of time. Constant information, pressure to perform, disrupted sleep, irregular eating patterns, none of it feels extreme in isolation, but together it creates a background state that the human body was never really designed to live in. The goal here isn't to create concern or to make you feel like something is wrong with you. It's the opposite. It's to give you a clearer way of interpreting what your body might already be trying to communicate. Fatigue, stubborn weight changes, poor sleep, low motivation, these are not random events. They are signals from a system trying to adapt. When you start viewing your body through that lens, the conversation changes. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" it becomes, "What is my system responding to right now?" That shift in awareness is often where real change begins. If this helped you understand things in a different way, you can stay with me for deeper explanations like this. And if you've experienced anything similar, feeling stuck despite doing everything right, share it in the comments. Those real experiences help shape future discussions and make this conversation more grounded in reality.